So $15 an hour. Why only $15 an hour? I mean, it's like the masks, you know? Well, if one mask is good, two masks is better. Why not three? Why not seven? Why not 25? Same thing with minimum wage. Why shouldn't the minimum wage be something really living? And maybe, you know, something that includes like where you could buy a house, maybe like $60,000 a year. I mean, why don't we just do that? Why stop at 15? Brian Riedl is with us. He's the senior fellow of the Manhattan Institute. He's a guy who doesn't care who's in office, Republicans or Democrats. He points out both of them suck when it comes to actually living by the budget. And we wanted to talk to him about the $15 wage and also how long can we last at these kind of spending limits. We go to Brian now. Hi, Brian. How are you?
I'm great, Glenn. How are you?
Very good. By the way, I forgot to mention you were also one of the researchers and co-authors of the book Broke, which was fantastic. At least they tell me.
It was a great book. I was honored to have helped in my own little way.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Okay, so Brian, let's talk about the $15 wage. What will that do to the nation?
Well, you know, the Congressional Budget Office said that even if we did it gradually during an economic boom, it would cost between 1.3 and 3.7 million jobs. Instead, they're talking about doing it during a recession, which means you're going to lose even more. But that's not even the worst of it. They would also raise the tipped minimum wage, you know, what waiters and waitresses make, from $2.13 to $15. So think of what restaurants are going through right now. Restaurants are going through their worst crisis in history. Millions have gone under. Many others are on the brink of bankruptcy. And the solution in the stimulus bill is to increase their minimum wage by 600%. I mean, it is economic malpractice.
So, Brian, explain to people who don't understand. You know, these big companies, they could afford $15 an hour. Explain why this cancels their jobs.
Because not all big companies can afford it. You know, profit margins aren't that big. And especially small businesses really often cannot afford it, especially in low-cost places like Mississippi and Puerto Rico. You know, they tried raising the minimum wage really high in Puerto Rico about 15 years ago, and it cost something like 40% unemployment.
Oh, my gosh.
But here's another point. Even if companies can afford it, it doesn't mean they will. Because, you know, companies aren't charities. If they're going to take a loss on an employee, if that employee is only worth $10 an hour, they're not going to pay them $15 even if they can afford it. What they're going to do is switch to automation. And that's why the higher the minimum wage goes, the more likely it is that you're going to walk into a Taco Bell and go up to a little machine and press a lot of buttons in order to get your Big Mac. I
mean, it was the old automat, or the old, what is it, Automatic, I think, was the restaurant up in New York where you didn't have anybody waiting on you back in the 1930s. Now there's no one behind the machine to stuff the food in. Now it will just be a machine. And we would call that progress anywhere else, but because it's going to put people out of work now, it's going to be devastating to the economy, especially when you have truck drivers who are going to be the first on the block when automated trucks are everywhere on the highway.
And that's part of the plan. You know, Andrew Yang has been saying we need universal basic income for all the jobs lost to automation. Well, they're speeding up the shift to automation by essentially banning all jobs that don't pay $15 an hour. You're going to put a lot of people out of work. Then we're going to have to spend $1 trillion on their universal basic income payment. So you're going to end up paying for that too.
So there are places like in New York City, and not today. There are places in New York City with $15 an hour would be reasonable. You know, you've got to pay higher if you're living in New York City. But there are also places all over the country where $15 an hour is quite a haul.
Yeah, this is why $15 is crazy for a national number. It's not sensitive to local economies and local conditions. You know, Seattle and San Francisco, can afford it much easier than places like, again, Mississippi or Puerto Rico, where prices are lower, wages are lower. In Mississippi, the average manufacturing job doesn't even pay $15 an hour. Forget fast food. Even a manufacturing job doesn't pay that. And that's why I think that the better solution is to leave minimum wage up to the states.
Mm-hmm.
Some states have been raising their minimum wage. Some cities have been raising their minimum wage. Other cities and states with lower costs haven't, because the local elected officials understand a little better the local economic conditions and needs. A $15 national floor is bonkers coming out of Washington.
Tell me about Seattle, because the initial response was this is going to put the restaurants out of business. What has happened to Seattle since they put this in?
Seattle has done a $15 wage, and it has slowed down employment, certainly. It hasn't caused an epic crash in the state, but the employment growth over the last couple of years certainly slowed down. There has been somewhat of a shift to automation. Even the trade-off exists in Seattle. It hasn't caused a crash, but there has been a definite slowdown in the growth of a lot of the jobs that are affected by the minimum wage.
So we have, according to President Biden now, $11 trillion in new spending over the decade. They're no longer looking for the offsets. He's saying that $3 trillion in new taxes will help offset that. I mean, we're printing money, right? I mean, we're really on modern monetary theory at this point, right? Without calling it that.
We are. In fact, last year when we ran a $3.3 trillion deficit, 2/3 of that was funded by the Federal Reserve, was funded by the printing press. So we are printing money. We're not taxing it. We're not even really borrowing it. We're funding it out of the printing press.
Right.
And you're right. I mean, what Biden has proposed is $11 trillion in new spending over the decade. To put that in context, John Kerry proposed $2 trillion over the decade in 2004. Obama proposed $1 trillion. Hillary Clinton proposed $2 trillion. Then Biden proposed $11 trillion, which shows that although Biden ran as a moderate, today's Democratic Party has shifted so far to the left that $11 trillion sounded like a moderate. It's a huge amount. And by the way, that $11 trillion, that's on top of the baseline deficit of about $15 trillion over the decade. So really, Biden would have us run total deficits of about $26 trillion over the decade.
Is that number optimistic too, Brian? I mean, does that reflect reality, even $26 trillion?
It's optimistic in that those numbers were before the recession.
Wow. And also assumes no interest rate hikes.
Exactly. These numbers, the scary thing about all these numbers is they assume interest rates stay low forever. And let me tell you, if interest rates rise 1 point higher than the Congressional Budget Office assumes, that would add $30 trillion over 30 years in interest.
My gosh.
Oh
my gosh. Okay, so wow. People say this is not Weimar, it's not Zimbabwe, and it's not yet. It wasn't Weimar until a certain point, and then it was like, oh my gosh, and it's too late. Any idea when it becomes too late? I mean, we are headed, correct me if I'm wrong, we're headed for a Zimbabwe or a Weimar if we don't stop this at some point, right?
Oh, the trends are absolutely unsustainable. I mean, in total, the Congressional Budget Office proposed $104 trillion in deficits over the next 30 years, even before the recession, even with low interest rates. $104 trillion over 30 years. You add in a little interest rate increase, you add in what we're going through right now, you could be up to $150 trillion over 30 years.
Okay, so
these numbers are so big, it sounds like monopoly money.
And it will be monopoly money.
Yeah, at some point, the system can't hold it up, and that could be in 5 years, 7 years, 10 years. A lot of it really depends on the bond market. To the extent that the bond market is lending Washington money, at some point they're going to say, we're going to stop lending you. We don't think you're good for this. This is ridiculous. And you're going to have to pay us twice as high of interest rates to compensate for the risk. At that point, you get into this vicious circle where Washington has to pay higher interest rates in order to attract lenders, which only makes the borrowing more, which makes them even more nervous, which requires even higher interest rates. At that point, I think what happens is Washington says, okay, forget finding lenders, we're just going to use the printing press. And that's when you start looking like Weimar Germany.
Well, didn't we already kind of hit this in some ways? I mean, I think it was over last summer or the summer before. We offered bonds, and nobody took them, and the Fed just started buying them.
Yeah, I mean, in the short term, we're facing that right now because with deficits $3.3 trillion last year, could be even bigger this year, there just isn't enough people buying bonds to pay for that. As a matter of fact, the number of borrowing we're getting internationally, new borrowing, has been pretty much zero. China and Japan have not been buying our bonds at all. And domestically, there just isn't enough savers in order to pay for all this. So right now, we're facing, the printing press running it because we can't find $3 to $4 trillion a year for domestic people to lend to us. Now, hopefully, as the recession ends, the deficit goes down to only $1 or $2 trillion a year. I put "only" in air quotes. That'll be a little bit easier to finance, but it's not sustainable long term to keep borrowing $1, $2, $3 trillion a year.